In May 1945, the guns fell silent across Europe, and celebration spilt into the streets that had known years of blackout and bombing. Yet beneath the relief, Britain emerges exhausted. The war has drained reserves, strained shipping, and hollowed out foreign earnings. Peace arrives without plenty. Food remains rationed, meals are planned around scarcity, and for millions of households, daily life continues to be measured in ounces and allowances, rather than abundance. The problem is not only what Britain can grow or import, but what it can afford. During the war, overseas investments have been sold, debts accumulated, and trade patterns disrupted. Now that the fighting is over, Britain must still import vast quantities of food and raw materials. Many of these imports can only be purchased with dollars, currency Britain no longer earns in sufficient quantities. The nation has won the war, but it is running out of money to sustain the peace. Rationing, far from easing, tightens in some areas. In 1946, bread never rationed during the war itself came under control. It is a symbolic moment. For many it feels as though victory has brought not relief, but a continuation of sacrifice. The government insists this is temporary, a necessary stage on the road to recovery, yet frustration grows. People expect peace to taste better than war. Inside Whitehall, officials confront a stark equation. Britain must feed its population, maintain social stability, and rebuild its economy, all while operating under severe financial constraint. Imports from North America are reliable but expensive. European agriculture is still recovering from devastation. The margin for error is thin. Every decision carries political weight. Food, in this context, becomes more than sustenance. It becomes a strategy. Securing food and calories is directly tied to Britain's economic independence and political credibility. Shortages threaten industrial output, public morale, and the legitimacy of a government elected on promises of renewal. Ministers are under pressure not merely to manage scarcity, but to demonstrate that it has an endpoint. Attention turns increasingly toward the empire. During the war, colonial territories supplied troops, labor, and resources on a massive scale. That experience reshapes post-war thinking. If the empire could be mobilized to fight, perhaps it could now be mobilized to feed. Land overseas is discussed as a capacity waiting to be unlocked, a reserve that could be organized and directed from the center. Maps are spread across desks, acreage is estimated in millions, climate charts and rainfall averages are consulted, often in simplified form. The language of wartime logistics carries over into peacetime planning. Where convoys once moved tanks and fuel, planners now imagine harvests moving grain and oilseeds. The belief takes hold that scale itself is the solution. There is also a political urgency behind this vision. The post-war Labour government has committed itself to ambitious domestic reforms, housing, healthcare, and welfare. These programs depend on economic stability and public patience. Prolonged shortages risk undermining both. A bold agricultural scheme offers something tangible to point to, proof that action is being taken, that recovery is being engineered rather than merely hoped for. Tanganyika enters this discussion not because it is well understood, but because it appears to offer space. It is a vast territory in East Africa, administered by Britain under a League of Nations mandate and later as a United Nations trust. To officials in London, it seems underutilized, lightly populated by imperial standards, and distant enough to be reshaped without immediate political resistance. The complexity of local land use rarely intrudes into these early calculations. What matters is potential. Reports speak of flat land, long growing seasons, and the possibility of mechanized agriculture on a scale rarely attempted in the tropics. Wartime experience has reinforced confidence in machinery. Tractors, bulldozers, and railways have won battles and moved armies. There is an assumption that they can just as effectively conquer distance, soil, and climate. The urgency of the post-war moment leaves little room for doubt. Britain cannot afford slow experiments or cautious pilots. Each year of shortage is a year of political vulnerability. Speed becomes a virtue in itself. Plans that promise quick results rise to the top, even when the underlying knowledge is incomplete. Among the crops considered, groundnuts, peanuts begin to stand out. They are rich in oil, a critical component of both diet and industry. They can be processed into margarine and cooking fats that Britain lacks. On paper, they neatly fit the problem. Grow them in large quantities overseas, ship them home, and ease the pressure on rationing and imports. By mid-1946, the idea had hardened into intention. The empire will once again be asked to solve a crisis at the center. Tanganyika's landscape is reduced to figures and forecasts. its seasons compressed into averages. The land itself has no voice in the decision. The momentum of post-war urgency carries the plan forward. In Tanganyika, nothing has changed yet. The bush still stands. The soil follows rhythms shaped by rainfall and use over generations. But far away, in London, decisions are being finalized that will soon transform these calculations into action. Victory has created an expectation of control, that with organization, discipline, and machinery, any problem can be mastered. Food shortages, currency crises, and even unfamiliar environments are treated as technical challenges awaiting the right plan. It is within this mindset that a single crop is chosen to feed an empire before the land is asked to grow it. It has truly been understood. By late 1946, the urgency of Britain's post-war food crisis had been translated into files, charts, and confident projections. In London, the Tanganyika Groundnut Scheme first appeared as an idea, clean, ordered, and persuasive. Lines drawn across paper promise transformation. Acres become numbers. Seasons become averages. Risk is reduced to footnotes. At the center of this effort stands a new institution, the Overseas Food Corporation. Created to deliver results quickly, it is granted wide authority and substantial funding. Its mandate is simple in wording and immense in scale: produce food overseas to relieve Britain's shortages at home. The scheme is not framed as an experiment, but as an operation, something to be executed, not tested. Cabinet approval follows swiftly between June and August 1946. Ministers are briefed on the promise of scale, millions of acres, hundreds of thousands of tons of groundnuts, and a steady flow of oil back to Britain. The language of wartime mobilization dominates the discussion. This is presented as the agricultural equivalent of a military campaign, complex, ambitious, but achievable with the right coordination. Underlying these approvals is a powerful assumption that land in Tanganyika is broadly available. Reports describe vast tracts as underused or empty, a perception shaped more by aerial surveys and colonial records than by close knowledge of local practice. Shifting cultivation, grazing cycles, and seasonal use do not register clearly in metropolitan planning. What matters is what can be seen from above and measured at a distance. Confidence in machinery reinforces this view. The war has demonstrated the power of mechanization on an unprecedented scale. Tractors, bulldozers, and transport vehicles are credited with overcoming obstacles from North Africa to Normandy. Planners assume that the same tools can tame the African bush and soil. Mechanical force is expected to compensate for limited local agricultural data. Environmental studies, where they exist, are narrow. Rainfall figures are drawn from incomplete records. Soil surveys are rushed or extrapolated across wide areas. Variability between years, between locations, between soil types is smoothed into averages that make planning easier. The land is treated as consistent, predictable, and compliant. The scheme's design reflects this optimism. Groundnuts are chosen for monoculture planting across large contiguous areas. Mixed farming, crop rotation, and local adaptation are set aside in favor of standardization. Uniform methods promise efficiency. Uniform crops promise easier processing and shipping. Diversity is seen as a complication, not resilience. There is also a belief that wartime experience has created a generation of administrators capable of managing such complexity. Logistics officers who have coordinated supply lines across continents are now tasked with coordinating agricultural supply chains. Their skills are real, but their context has changed. In war, obstacles are often human and mechanical. In agriculture, they are ecological, seasonal, and cumulative. The speed of approval leaves little space for dissent. Voices urging caution are noted but outweighed by the political need to act. Delay itself is framed as a danger. Each missed planting season is another year of rationing, another year of public frustration. The scheme is sold as the fastest route to relief, and speed becomes its own justification. By the end of 1946, paper plans were already being converted into orders. Machinery is purchased in Britain, often in competition with domestic needs. Tractors and bulldozers are crated and shipped thousands of miles. Spare parts, fuel, and personnel follow. The logistical tail grows long and heavy before the first groundnut seed is planted. What is striking is how little the plan changes as it moves from draft to directive. Assumptions harden into facts through repetition. Maps acquire authority simply by being circulated. Each signature added to a document reinforces the sense that the scheme is not only desirable but inevitable. Local input is minimal. Tanganyika's existing agricultural officers are consulted, but their caution struggles to compete with the momentum generated in London. knowledge that cannot be easily quantified. Experience of soil behavior, bush regrowth, or labor patterns carries less weight than projections expressed in tables and graphs. The scheme's structure reflects this imbalance. Decision-making is centralized. Targets are set from afar. Feedback loops are weak, designed to report progress rather than question premises. The expectation is that difficulties will be technical and temporary, solvable through adjustment rather than reassessment. As the first convoys of machinery make their way toward East Africa, confidence remains high. Public statements emphasize ambition and necessity. The Groundnut Scheme is presented as a symbol of post-war resolve, a demonstration that Britain, though weakened, can still plan and act on a global scale. Yet even at this stage, cracks are visible beneath the surface. Environmental uncertainty has been minimized rather than resolved. Logistical complexity has been acknowledged but underestimated. The scheme's success depends on everything aligning: weather, soil, machinery, transport, and labor, across distances measured in thousands of miles. On paper, these elements align neatly. In reality, they have not yet met. As 1947 approaches, the plan leaves the world of memoranda and enters the landscape itself. Machinery begins to move before knowledge has fully arrived. The future of Britain's food supply is no longer confined to offices and committees. It is being shipped, piece by piece, toward land that will soon be asked to conform to a vision drawn far away. When the first machinery reaches Kongwa in late 1946, the gap between paper and ground becomes immediately visible. Kongwa lies inland, away from the coast, reached by long rail journeys and rough feeder roads. On maps it appears suitable: broad expanses, workable gradients, and rainfall figures that seem adequate. On arrival, those abstractions dissolve into texture: soil that resists blades, bush that regrows faster than expected, and seasons that refuse to follow averages. Clearing begins with confidence. Bulldozers push into the scrub, and tractors drag plows through earth assumed to be cooperative. Almost at once, the machines struggle. Beneath the surface, the soil is harder than anticipated, packed and uneven. In places, it turns to dust. In others, it clings stubbornly to metal. Blades blunt quickly. Engines overheat. Breakdowns multiply. Rainfall, so reassuring on paper, proves unpredictable in practice. Some months bring downpours that halt work entirely, turning cleared ground into mud. Others pass with far less rain than expected, leaving freshly turned soil dry and brittle. The timing of rains matters as much as their total, and here too the averages mislead. Planting windows are narrow, schedules slip. The machinery itself becomes a source of delay. Tractors designed for European fields are pushed to their limits in unfamiliar conditions. Spare parts are scarce, delayed by shipping bottlenecks and long supply chains. A single broken component can idle a machine for weeks. Workshops struggle to keep pace with repairs. What was meant to be a force multiplier becomes, at times, a fragile dependency. As clearing slows, planting falls behind. Acres are left unseeded, leaving bare ground exposed. When planting does occur, yields disappoint. Some fields fail to germinate evenly, others produce weak crops vulnerable to weather and pests. Each setback compounds the next. Lost time cannot be recovered once a season passes. The human effort behind the machines is intense. Engineers, operators, and administrators work long hours to maintain momentum. Many believe deeply in the scheme's purpose. Failure, at this stage, is not an option. They are prepared to accept. Problems are framed as teething troubles, inevitable difficulties in any large operation, yet the scale of those difficulties continues to grow. Bush cleared one month and begins to regenerate the next. Maintaining open land requires repeated effort, further taxing machines and crews. The assumption that clearing is a one-time task proves false. Nature pushes back steadily, without urgency. Reports sent back to London attempt to balance honesty with reassurance. They note challenges but emphasize progress. Figures are adjusted, projections are revised. The belief persists that once a critical threshold is crossed, once enough land is cleared, enough experience gained, the scheme will stabilize and accelerate. Instead, the opposite occurs. Delays increase costs. Idle machinery still requires maintenance and fuel. Transport schedules become congested as equipment, parts, and supplies compete for limited rail capacity. The logistical system begins to strain under its own weight. Rainfall variability continues to disrupt planning. Fields prepared in anticipation of rain sometimes receive too little. Others are flooded at the wrong moment. Without long-term, site-specific data, each season feels like a surprise. The land reveals itself not as a uniform resource, but as a patchwork of conditions that resist standardization. By late 1947, it was clear to those on the ground that Kongwa was not delivering what the scheme required. Yields fall far short of targets. The gap between cleared acreage and productive acreage widens. The original assumptions about soil, climate, and the power of machinery are no longer defensible in practice. And yet, retreat remains unthinkable. Too much has already been invested, financially, politically, and psychologically. Admitting that Kongwa cannot work as planned would call the entire scheme into question. Instead, attention turns outward. If one site is failing, perhaps others will succeed. The logic is familiar: spread the risk, increase the scale, and average out local problems. New locations are identified. Urambo, Nachingwea, different soils, different climates, perhaps more forgiving. Thus, the response to difficulty is not contraction, but expansion. The scheme doubles down on its original premise, extending its reach even as evidence mounts that the premise itself may be flawed. As reports of Kongwa's struggles accumulate, London listens with growing unease, but not yet with alarm. For now, the belief endures that success lies just beyond the next clearing, the next season, the next site. The land at Kongwa has delivered its verdict, but it is not yet the final one. The scheme moves forward, carrying its assumptions with it, toward new ground that has yet to be tested. By 1947, the difficulties at Kongwa are no longer isolated problems, they are patterns. Clearing targets are missed, planting schedules slip, and yields remain far below projections. Yet the response from the centre is not withdrawal. Instead, the scheme widens. If one location cannot meet expectations, the answer, it is believed, lies in finding others that will. Urambo and Nachingwea are selected as new fronts in the effort. On paper, they offer different conditions. Soils thought to be lighter, rainfall assumed to be more reliable. In reality, preparation is even thinner than before. The pressure to show progress overrides caution. Lessons from Kongwa are noted, but not fully absorbed. Machinery is diverted and redistributed across vast distances. Tractors and bulldozers are hauled along overburdened rail lines, competing with civilian traffic and other colonial needs. Ports struggle to handle the volume. Each movement adds delay and cost, and each delay tightens the schedule for planting. Transport becomes a central weakness. The scheme depends heavily on railways, never designed to support such concentrated heavy traffic. Breakdowns ripple outward. A stalled train delays spare parts, which grounds machinery, leaving the land uncleared when the rains arrive. The system lacks slack. Minor failures cascade into major setbacks. At the new sites, familiar problems return. Clearing is slower than expected. Bush regrows quickly. Soil conditions vary sharply across short distances. Machinery again proves ill-suited to the task, pushed hard in environments for which it was never designed. Repairs lag behind demand, and experienced operators are spread thin. Labor adds another layer of strain. Recruiting and retaining workers for remote sites proves difficult. Local economies are disrupted, as men are drawn into the scheme, sometimes at the expense of existing agriculture. Productivity suffers when labor turnover is high and training is incomplete. These effects are real, but they remain secondary concerns in reports focused on acreage and output. As expansion continues, the disparity between effort and result becomes harder to ignore. Thousands of acres are cleared, but only a fraction is successfully planted. Of that, only a smaller fraction yields usable crops. The numbers, when examined closely, tell a story of diminishing returns. Each additional acre costs more to prepare and produces less in return. By 1948, internal assessments began to acknowledge the depth of the problem. The scheme is consuming resources at an alarming rate while delivering little of what was promised. Groundnut exports remain negligible. Britain's rationing situation is largely unchanged. The bold solution has yet to produce tangible relief. Still, public statements remain cautiously optimistic. Officials emphasize long-term potential and frame setbacks as temporary. The language of perseverance replaces the language of certainty. Admitting failure is politically dangerous. Too many reputations and too much public money are tied to the project. Within the administration, doubts harden. The logistical complexity alone is overwhelming. Coordinating land clearing, planting, harvesting, transport and shipping across multiple sites in a territory with limited infrastructure proves far more difficult than anticipated. Centralized control, once seen as a strength, becomes a bottleneck. The scale of the operation now works against it. Managing a sprawling, underperforming enterprise absorbs time and attention that could have been used to reassess fundamentals. Expansion multiplies problems faster than solutions. Each new site adds uncertainty, not stability. As costs climb and results stagnate, pressure builds in London. Parliamentary questions become sharper. Financial oversight tightens. The scheme's defenders struggle to explain why so much effort has yielded so little. The promise that expansion would solve early problems begins to ring hollow. By the end of 1948, the Groundnut Scheme stands at a critical point. It has grown too large to ignore and too troubled to defend easily. The distance between ambition and reality has widened into a visible gap, one that can no longer be bridged by optimism alone. In London, the tone shifts. Confidence gives way to concern. The question is no longer how quickly the scheme will succeed, but whether it can succeed at all. And as that question gains urgency, the search begins for an answer that numbers and assurances can no longer provide. By 1948, the Groundnut Scheme is no longer judged by promises or projections, but by accounts. In London, the language surrounding the project begins to change. Where earlier discussions focused on acreage and future yield, attention now turns to expenditure, losses, and return. The arithmetic of optimism gives way to the arithmetic of reality. From the outset, the scheme has been expensive. Heavy machinery has been purchased in large quantities, shipped thousands of miles, and maintained at great cost. Rail transport, port handling, fuel, spare parts, housing, and administration all draw steadily on public funds. These costs were expected, but only on the assumption that output would soon follow. It has not. By late 1948, it became clear that the gap between investment and production is vast. Cleared land far exceeds planted land. Planted land far exceeds harvested land, and harvested groundnuts, when counted, fall dramatically short of what Britain was promised. The flow of oil and fats back to Britain is minimal, so small that it barely registers against national consumption. Estimates of total cost begin to circulate, and they are unsettling. Contemporary figures vary depending on how overheads and sunk costs are counted, but most place the expenditure between £36 and £49 million. Even at the lower end, this represents a staggering sum for a country still struggling to rebuild after war. Each ton of groundnuts produced has cost many times its market value. The political implications are immediate. Rationing remains in place. Bread is still controlled. The public has seen no visible benefit from a scheme that has consumed years and resources. What was meant to shorten austerity has become another symbol of it. In Parliament, questions grow sharper. How did this happen? Who approved it? Why were warnings not heeded? Defenders of the scheme point to its long-term nature. Agriculture, they argue, cannot be judged in its early years alone. They stress that infrastructure has been built, experience has been gained, and land has been prepared. But these arguments struggle to carry weight when set against mounting losses and unchanged shortages at home. The Treasury, increasingly uneasy, presses for clarity. Financial oversight tightens. Projections are re-examined line by line. What emerges is not a story of bad luck, but of compounding misjudgment. Environmental uncertainty, logistical fragility, and administrative overreach have interacted in ways that magnify each other's effects. Reports from Tanganyika grow more candid. They acknowledge that even under improved conditions, the scale of production originally promised is unlikely to be achieved. Soil limitations remain, rainfall variability persists, machinery wear continues to outpace replacement. Each constraint limits the others, there is no single fix. At the same time, Britain's broader economic position begins to stabilize through other means. American loans, European recovery, and gradual improvements in trade ease some of the pressure that made the scheme seem indispensable in 1946. The Groundnut Scheme no longer appears as the only route out of crisis, just the most conspicuous. This shift alters the political calculus. What was once framed as necessary risk-taking now looks increasingly like avoidable excess. The argument that failure was unforeseeable becomes harder to sustain as internal correspondence reveals earlier doubts and incomplete studies. The question is no longer whether the scheme is underperforming, but whether continuing it makes sense at all. Public confidence erodes quietly rather than explosively. There is no single scandal, no dramatic collapse. Instead, there is a steady accumulation of unease. Journalists write cautiously critical pieces. Economists raise concerns about opportunity cost. What else might have been done with the same resources? The scheme's name begins to carry an undertone of embarrassment. Within government, attention turns to accountability. Responsibility is diffuse. Decisions were made collectively, across departments, under pressure. No single figure can easily be blamed. This diffusion, once a protection against error, now complicates correction. Ending the scheme would be an admission not just of failure, but of systemic weakness. By early 1949, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The Groundnut scheme must be formally examined. Assurances and internal reviews are no longer enough. An external assessment is required, one that can evaluate planning, execution, and oversight with authority. The decision to appoint an investigator marks a turning point. It signals that confidence has been exhausted. The scheme has moved from being a symbol of post-war ambition to a subject of official scrutiny. What began as a response to hunger is now measured against its cost to credibility and trust. As the figures are gathered and the questions prepared, the future of the scheme hangs in the balance. The land in Tanganyika has resisted control, the machinery has failed to deliver certainty, and now the numbers themselves demand an answer that will soon arrive in the form of a report, one that will decide whether anything of the grand vision can still be salvaged, or whether the project must finally be allowed to end. In 1949, as confidence drains away and pressure mounts, the British government turns to a formal investigation. Sir Alan Pym, a respected administrator with experience in finance and oversight, is appointed to examine the Groundnut scheme in detail. His task is not to manage the project, but to judge it, to determine what went wrong, how it went wrong, and whether it can be justified to continue. The decision itself is revealing. It signals that internal explanations are no longer sufficient. The scheme has outgrown its political protection. What was once defended as bold experimentation now requires independent scrutiny. Pym is given access to records, correspondence, and financial accounts. He listens to officials in London and reviews reports from Tanganyika. Slowly, a picture takes shape. When the Pym report emerges in 1950, its conclusions are measured but unmistakable. The failure of the Groundnut scheme, Pym argues, cannot be attributed to a single misfortune or unlucky season. It is structural. The project was launched with inadequate knowledge, unrealistic assumptions, and a governance framework poorly suited to its scale and environment. Central to Pym's findings is the problem of planning. Environmental uncertainty was not simply underestimated, it was built into the scheme from the beginning. Soil surveys were incomplete, rainfall data was insufficiently localized. Decisions were made on averages that masked extreme variation. In Pym's assessment, the land was never properly understood before it was committed. Equally damaging was the assumption that wartime experience could be transferred wholesale into peacetime agriculture. The report notes that logistical success in war does not guarantee agricultural success in unfamiliar environments. Machinery designed for European fields was deployed in tropical conditions without adequate adaptation. When it failed, the system lacked resilience. Pym also highlights weaknesses in administration. Authority was fragmented between departments, while responsibility was centralized without effective feedback. Problems identified on the ground traveled slowly upward, often softened by optimism or delayed by procedure. By the time serious concerns reached decision-makers, the scheme had already moved too far forward. Financial oversight receives particular attention. Costs escalated without a corresponding reassessment of feasibility. Sunk costs created pressure to continue, even as evidence mounted that original targets were unattainable. The report is careful in tone, but its implication is clear. Money was spent to defend earlier decisions rather than to test whether those decisions remained sound. Importantly, Pym does not place blame solely on individuals. He frames the scheme as a product of its moment, a moment shaped by post-war urgency, institutional confidence, and political pressure. The war had rewarded boldness and speed. In peace, those same qualities proved hazardous when applied without restraint. By the time the report is debated, the scheme is already winding down in practice. Machinery stands idle or underused. Clearing has slowed dramatically. Planting is reduced to minimal levels. The question is no longer whether the Groundnut scheme will succeed, but how it will be ended. Public reaction is subdued rather than dramatic. The findings confirm what many already suspect. There is no single revelation, only confirmation of accumulated doubt. In Parliament, the tone is sober. The scheme is described as overambitious, mismanaged, and poorly conceived, but also as an earnest attempt to solve a real problem. In Tanganyika, the effects are more tangible. Workers are reassigned or released. Infrastructure built for the scheme, roads, rail spurs, workshops, remains, but without the purpose for which it was designed. The land, partially cleared and partially abandoned, bears the marks of interrupted ambition. For the British government, the Pym report marks the end of the episode. It provides justification to terminate the project while preserving institutional dignity. The language of reform replaces the language of failure. Lessons will be learned, procedures will be improved, future development schemes will proceed more cautiously. By January 1951, the Groundnut Scheme was formally abandoned. The decision is quiet, administrative, and almost anticlimactic. There is no ceremony, no announcement of closure commensurate with the scale of the original promise. The project simply ends, absorbed into the larger story of post-war adjustment. Yet the significance of the Pym report extends beyond this single scheme. It exposes the limits of centralized planning when divorced from local knowledge. It challenges the assumption that technology alone can overcome environmental complexity, and it reveals how political urgency can narrow the space for critical evaluation. What survives after abandonment is not the harvest once imagined, but a body of experience, costly, contested, and instructive. Files are archived, procedures revised. Development policy slowly shifts towards smaller-scale projects and more extensive research. The Groundnut Scheme fades from immediate concern, but it does not disappear. It lingers in memory as a warning and a reference point, a reminder of what happens when ambition outruns understanding. And as Britain moves forward, redefining its relationship with empire and expertise, the fields of Tanganyika remain behind, bearing quiet witness to a moment when confidence collided with reality and an empire was forced to confront the limits of its own planning. After 1951, the Tanganyika Groundnut Scheme no longer exists as an active project, but its presence does not simply vanish. It lingers in reports, debates, and institutional memory. What was once framed as a solution to post-war hunger becomes a reference point, a shorthand for overreach, haste, and misplaced confidence in scale. The land itself remains, but the meaning of the scheme shifts from promise to lesson. In Britain, the immediate crisis that gave birth to the project gradually receded. Food supplies stabilized through a combination of imports, European recovery, and changes in domestic production. Rationing eases, then ends. In hindsight, the urgency that once made the Groundnut Scheme seem unavoidable appears less absolute. That change in context reshapes how the scheme is judged. Within government, its legacy is most visible in the evolution of development policy. The idea that large, centrally planned agricultural projects can be imposed quickly and successfully on unfamiliar environments loses credibility. Future schemes place greater emphasis on research, pilot projects, and local adaptation. An environmental study, once treated as a mere formality, is now a prerequisite rather than an afterthought. The Colonial Office, and later development agencies that replaced it, began to reconsider how expertise is defined and applied. Technical knowledge from Europe is no longer assumed to be universally transferable. Greater attention is paid to agronomy, ecology, and long-term observation. These shifts are uneven and incomplete, but they mark a departure from the assumptions that underpinned the Groundnut Scheme. The project also influences thinking about accountability. The diffusion of responsibility that protected decision-makers during the scheme's rise is recognized as a weakness. Clearer lines of oversight, staged funding, and formal review mechanisms are introduced to prevent momentum from overriding evidence. Failure, the lesson suggests, is often not sudden but cumulative. In Tanganyika, the scheme's physical remnants tell a quieter story. Roads, rail links, and cleared areas remain part of the landscape, sometimes repurposed, sometimes left to fade. For local communities, the project is remembered less as a grand imperial vision than as a disruptive episode. An interruption that brought machines, labor demands, and then withdrawal. Its benefits are uneven, its costs unevenly distributed. Historians later debate the scheme's deeper meaning. Some see it primarily as an economic failure, a costly miscalculation in a time of scarcity. Others interpret it as a symptom of a larger imperial problem, the belief that distance and difference could be erased by administration and technology. The Groundnut Scheme becomes a case study, taught and cited, rather than an anomaly to be forgotten. What distinguishes it from many failed projects is not simply its scale, but its timing. It emerges at the moment when Britain is redefining itself, transitioning from wartime mobilization to peacetime reconstruction, from imperial confidence to uncertainty about the future. The scheme sits at that intersection, carrying habits of command into a world that demands adaptation. The language used to describe the project evolves accordingly. Early optimism gives way to embarrassment, then to reflection. Official narratives emphasize learning rather than blame. The scheme is neither wholly condemned nor quietly excused. Instead, it occupies an ambiguous space, acknowledged as sincere in intent but flawed in execution. In debates on development beyond Britain, the Groundnut Scheme acquires symbolic weight. It is cited in discussions of large-scale agricultural transformation, the risks of monoculture, and the dangers of ignoring local conditions. Its story resonates because it is not unique. Similar patterns appear elsewhere, in different forms, across the 20th century. Yet the Groundnut Scheme remains distinctive in how clearly its assumptions collided with reality. The belief that land could be treated as empty, that averages could substitute for observation, and that machinery could compensate for uncertainty, all are exposed as fragile. The land did not conform, and the system lacked the flexibility to adjust. Seen from a distance, the scheme is not a story of incompetence alone. It is a story of pressure, of a government confronting real shortages and real political risk. The choices made in 1946 are shaped by fear of failure at home as much as by ambition abroad. Understanding that context does not excuse the outcome, but it explains the momentum that carried the project forward. In this sense, the Groundnut Scheme's most enduring lesson is about restraint. It shows how easily urgency can narrow vision and how scale can obscure complexity. It reminds planners that speed is not always efficiency and that confidence must be matched by curiosity and doubt. Today, the cleared fields of Tanganyika no longer serve the purpose once imagined for them, but the questions raised by the scheme about knowledge, power, and responsibility remain relevant. They echo in modern debates about development, sustainability, and intervention. The Groundnut Scheme failed to feed an empire. What it left behind instead was a warning that even in moments of necessity, the limits of land, knowledge, and control cannot be ignored. Explore the hidden lessons behind post-war ambition and failure, and how they still shape development thinking today. Like the video, share it with others who value grounded history, and help keep these stories alive. Subscribe for more calm, fact-driven .wide UI aftermath documentaries in the WW2 Tales series.